Hello, I'm Mark Norman, folklore researcher and author, and welcome back to another episode of the Folklore Podcast. I'd like to thank all of you who took the time to get in touch and tell me how much you enjoyed my recent episode on Dracula and its connections with my part of the world. Lots of you told me that you really enjoy the episodes that I write and present myself, and that was great to hear. Back at the start of this show, 10 years ago, there used to be more of these, with interviews in between, and this is a format that I'm striving to get back to. As you can appreciate, it takes a long time to research and write these episodes. Sadly, making this show doesn't pay my bills on its own, and so I do have to work on these between other writing, presenting, and the other work that I do. Those of you who donate via the website or join the Patreon make a big contribution, of course, and the more members there are, the more I'm able to do. Details at the end of the show, as usual, if you want to do that. I'm always really happy to look at requests for episodes too. S.R. Morton got in touch with me via Blue Sky with an idea that they'd like to see explored, and I'm working on writing that episode at the moment, so I hope to be able to bring that to you soon. In the meantime, today I'd like to present you with a recent conversation that I had with herbalist and author Su Bristow, who lives not too far from me here in the southwest of the UK. By day, Sue is a consultant medical herbalist, and her workroom has the perfect look of an old apothecary about it, which pleased me no end. She's written 2 books on the subject, the Herbal Medicine Chest and the Herb Handbook, and so we spent some time exploring the folklore surrounding plants, folk medicine and herbalism. Sue is also a fiction writer and has 2 successful novels out so far. Sealskin is an award-winning title set in the Hebrides and reworking the Scottish selkie myths, and Fairfolk, set in Surrey in the 1950s, looks at the landscape, agricultural change, and how one girl's desire to meet the fairies had wide-reaching consequences. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Sue. So this is a lovely interview to be doing because my guest today is sitting with me in the same room, and we have coffee and it's all very civilised, isn't it? Welcome, Sue.
Thank you. It's
lovely to sit down. I've known you for a while. We don't cross paths very often, even though we live less than an hour apart, probably.
That's
because
true.
Busy people, busy lives and all of those sorts of things. But here we are, and we have a great chance to catch up and talk about all sorts of things that listeners to this podcast are going to be fascinated in. So start us off with a little bit of a background about you and what you do, the kind of 2 sides to your folklore-y life, if you like, and how you got there in the first place.
Okay. Yes, where to start? I think it starts way back when I was a child, of course, because I was the kind of child that reads as soon as you possibly can and then disappears into books at every possible opportunity. I was the child whose mother actually said, "Put down that book and go and do something useful." She really did. And needless to say, I didn't obey. I just read everything. And the other strand that I was out of doors when I wasn't reading. I was lucky enough to live on the edge of a piece of woodland, and I went there whenever I could, by myself or with friends, but often by myself. Sometimes I went out and read in the woods. And that was also to do with the fascination with fairies and wanting to see them, wanting to meet them, trying to make things that might entice them. Having said all that, if I had met them when I was 8 years old, I probably wouldn't be sitting here now.
Woodlands, they're fascinating and magical places, and they are so evocative of those kinds of areas, aren't they? You know, the areas where we find the fae, yes.
We've always felt that they were out there on the margins, not in the bits that we've thoroughly domesticated, but just beyond. And this was exactly that, a place where people didn't go, where people didn't do anything, so it was open to other sorts of people.
So you spent lots of time in the woods, you read in the woods, but you didn't come across fairies in the woods.
I wished I had.
There wasn't an early influence there for things that we can perhaps talk about later on.
Yes.
Where did you go from there?
Well, when I was 13, I decided to change the world. So I began with myself. I took up yoga. I became a vegetarian. This at a time when it was very, very unfashionable. I decided not to eat anything with colouring and flavouring in it. My poor parents. And I went round charity collecting for Oxfam. I did a lot of different things like that. And I gardened. I took up gardening, which I had to learn about from books. We did have a garden, but both my parents were urban migrants and they knew nothing about gardening. The garden was a wilderness. When I was a small child, the grass was higher than my head in late summer. So yes, that was learning from books, which is a thing I have done all my life, and sometimes works and sometimes is not so good.
So part of your work now is as a herbalist, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So did that interest stem from this time, from being in the garden, from being outdoors,
Yes.
being in a natural environment?
Yes, partly I loved the names of the herbs: thyme, sage, basil, rosemary. You know, they have a magic of their own, and that was something I tried to bring in when I didn't cook at that stage, because I lived in my parents' home, of course, but I loved the different characters of them. And as time went on, I got interested in organic farming, went on demos, you know, about pollution as it was then, acid rain, nuclear power, all of those things. And by the time I got to university, I was really interested in both sustainability and how people look after themselves. And what I studied was archaeology and anthropology. So that has pretty much all of those strands, except for the farming, all mixed in together. It was brilliant. It was a really lovely, rich blend of lots and lots of stuff, and all that knowledge waiting to be hoovered up and trying to make sense of the world. I wanted answers. I wanted to know why we do what we do.
So I'm getting the sense that there are kind of two strands here. There's that kind of early strand of your time in nature that feeds into the herbalism side of your work, perhaps significantly. And then you went to Cambridge, and your time at Cambridge with archaeology and anthropology has a natural progression into the folklore side as well, perhaps. But the two kind of join up in the middle there as well. And you were telling me before we started recording as well about the whole environment of the types of, you know, extra lectures and things that university gives the opportunity to, that kind of also honed that interest. Yeah, it
was such a rich place. I mean, you could go to talks on almost anything. You could try your hand at ESP, extrasensory perception, and go and listen to somebody who was a practicing witch. There were talks by Alan Garner and Lang, and people who were foremost in their field at the time. I mean, it was amazing, you know. And all of those strands, yes, they all come together. What I came to specialise in my last year at Cambridge was ethnomedicine.
Right.
Because I was interested in what people do when all they've got are the natural resources and their own imagination. And what they do basically is herbal medicine with, they don't think of just plants, of course. People will use whatever comes to hand. But basically natural medicine, you could say, and psychodrama. You will do ritual, or you'll do what Terry Pratchett calls headology.
Yes.
You know? And that very much feeds into herbal medicine, of course.
So did you go straight into this area when you left university? Did you go straight into herbalism, or did you take other routes first?
I wandered about. I'd had enough of academia. I wanted to learn more about organic farming, and I wanted to experience communal living. I was interested in alternative forms of living. So I discovered, or had already discovered, WOOF, working weekends on organic farms, as it was then called. And I went to lots of places, and I stayed at some of them for several months at a time, picking up knowledge here and there and talking to lots of people. And eventually I found my way to a place in Suffolk, which was called Suryodaya. It was a sannyas centre, followers of Bhagwan, Sri Rajneesh. And it was also a natural therapeutics centre. And they did courses in massage, courses in a general introduction to natural medicine. And so that kind of firmed up my sense that that was where I wanted to go. And at that time, there were courses in homeopathy and acupuncture, but they were one weekend a month and they were quite short. The herb course, apart from the fact that it was to do with plants, which I already knew I was interested in, was very long. It was a minimum of 4 years. It was heavy duty. It used doctor's level textbooks of anatomy, physiology, etc. And it really went into depth. I wanted to be competent. I wanted to be able to diagnose things and know when to refer to somebody else and all of that, because you do get people who don't want to go to a doctor.
Yes.
You know, you do have to know what's going on. So when I had enough money, I started studying herbal medicine. And at that time, well, you still can, you could do it in a sort of open university structure where you do your modules and then you go to a seminar every so often and you go and sit in, have practice hours with practitioners who are already qualified. When I say that it's heavy duty, I can tell you that when I started in my first year, there were 115 students. In the qualifying year, there were only 15. So people drop out. It's much more challenging than you might think. You have to work at it to get to the magic part. And for a lot of people, that wasn't what they wanted to do. So they would start and they'd give up. It was too hard.
Possibly, I guess, because they didn't have a full understanding of what it was likely to entail at the beginning in many cases. So I'd like to just address that point a little bit then. Let's talk a little bit more about your role as a herbalist, because I think this is an area which obviously crosses over into folklore, folk medicine, folk remedy, all of these sorts of things, but also the medicinal aspect, and you're talking about, you know, doctor's level textbooks as well, and we have to bear this in mind.
Yeah.
And I think this is an area that is misunderstood perhaps by a lot of people, because when we look at the role of medicine that is not based in the NHS, for example, doctor-based medicine for those outside of the UK, then there are lots of schools of thought. There are people who think that this is all something very strange and odd. There are people who think that this is something that is, you know, absolutely to the letter correct. And then there are people who sit in the middle. Now, the beauty of herbalism, perhaps, against some of the other forms of complementary medicine, or whatever term you want to use to describe them, depending on how people see them, is that it's demonstrable.
Yes.
Yeah, and when we look back into history, of course, and I can see, for example, on the end of your table is Tabitha Stanmore's book Cunning Folk, for example, which looks at these areas.
It does.
You know, people who are termed witches for the sake of any other terminology, but natural healers and midwives and all of these sorts of things. What some people would refer to as old wives' tales when it comes to the use of plants and things like that. These are demonstrable effects. And when we look at modern medicine, a lot of the ingredients in modern medicines have their root, no pun intended, in early plant lore.
They can't help but have that.
Yeah.
About 80% of drugs are derived from plants.
Yes, exactly. So this is an area that is, you know, demonstrably effective, and is an area that is using science, not just using other things. So
Yes.
dispel myths for people. Explain exactly what you do, what herbalism in its true sense is.
Okay, well, I mean, you can practice at lots of levels. Of course you can. You can practice at the folk level, if you like, with things that have been handed down. And that's what housewives used to do. Mostly pre-literate people, just giving each other the recipes that they had found worked. There is an element of that. When I was studying back in the 80s, the school was trying very hard to look respectable in the eyes of the medical establishment. So they did put a heavy emphasis on being medically competent. And there's not ever been much research into quite a lot of herbs because the money isn't in it. Why would you bother, But the ones that have been investigated, of course, you can list their constituents. And we used to spend endless hours learning these constituents off by heart for each herb. And you can point to one particular constituent and say, well, that has this action. But when you're making a herbal prescription, it's going up several levels from there. You don't just bung a load of things in together. I mean, people sometimes come and say, well, I'm a bit depressed. I've heard that St. John's wort's good for depression. Can I have some? And I would never prescribe it just on its own. It's always going to work better in combination with a few other things and in combination with what I learn about the person's whole history. So, and for some people, it's not the right herb at all. So you're I think of it as a sort of triangle. There's me, there's my character, there are the characters of the individual plants that you're working with, and they do vary depending where they've grown and whether they've been wildcrafted or grown domesticated, and the person who's come to see you. And so you're putting all of those things together in a particular combination, and usually in a prescription there are 5 or 6 herbs which work with each other. So it varies as well, of course. The person who's coming to see you today will not be in the same place in a few weeks' time. So they won't just keep having the same repeat prescription over and over and over again. It will change. And you can work around if they're taking drugs too. Herbs are very supportive. They're on the whole, much more like food than medicine. They feed your system. They nourish your vital energy rather than knocking symptoms on the head. I mean, there are herbs that do that. You would probably know about foxglove, which can be used for heart problems, but we don't actually use that because the line between efficacy and toxicity is very narrow.
Yes, I was going to say it's not the safest of plants to use,
no,
is it?
It's not.
Yeah.
And in general, the core of herbal medicine is in that feeding, supportive, nourishing, gently sustaining kind of place.
And we have to remember, and we should point out at this point, as you mentioned, foxglove, for example, and the fact that it can be used both ways, that you have spent many, many years training to do what you do and to fully understand the implications of using various plants. And yet it's very easy to read a website that says you should use this for this, and for people to go, okay then,
Yeah.
And this is not necessarily wise, is it?
Well, the other great thing about herbal medicine is most of the remedies that are commonly available are not dangerous. But there are things you need to be aware of the cautions and the restrictions and the limits to dosage and so forth. And the trouble with the net is that, of course, you go looking and what you find is people trying to sell you something.
Yes.
And because you're vulnerable and you are hoping to find something that will help whatever distress you're in, you're very open to believing those things. I've had people come to me and say, I've read about this lovely herb and I really want you to put it in my mixture. And I look at the prescription and say, but it's already there. I put that in weeks ago, and they get disappointed because they've read all the stuff that bigs it up and they think this is going to be magic, this is going to cure me. Yeah. And it's not like that usually. It's slow and steady. It goes by increments, and people make those little shifts and then they consolidate them and then they make another one, and they're not in the same place a year later that they were
But I think people by their very nature are not the most patient of animals often, are
Oh,
they?
no, most people drop out after a few weeks. You know, oh, that didn't work. I'll go and do something else.
Yeah, and
of
you
course.
have to allow for that, I suppose, as
Yeah,
well.
you do.
I mean, there's a great crossover here between the work that you do and the folk side of it, of course, and the folklore of plants is a fantastic area to explore, and we have people who are very knowledgeable and very good at that. Roy Vickery comes to mind as being one of our prime experts in this area.
Yes.
Do you cross over much yourself into that side as well with what you do?
I do, and it partly depends on the patient. Some people want to be talked to in medical terms. Some people want to be talked to in witchy terms. You know, you have to. It's one of the primary things about building a rapport with a patient or a client is you meet them where they are. Otherwise, you can't go anywhere. You have to meet them where they are. So yes, you can work on lots of different levels, and the folklore aspects. There's a nice sort of guided meditation you can do, which takes you into visualization, a walk with a herb, and you taste it. And it's very possible to learn a lot about the properties of a herb by tasting. People often don't realize it's so simple. You know, the kind of taste, whether it's bitter or sweet, whether it's pungent or whether it dries your mouth, whether you feel it brings you out in a sweat or whatever, those are things that tell you a lot about what it will do if you take it medicinally.
Does the way that plant use, herb use, vary over time feed into this as well? So if we think about sources, we have modern sources and the textbook type sources that you're referring to.
Yeah.
And you go way back into history, and then you have possibly more problematic sources, and Culpeper is a prime example of a source that everybody turns to historically as being the definitive source, but of course he plagiarised most of his material from other places as well. Of course he did.
Plus he was a thinker who wanted to put things into boxes.
Yeah.
It's how we make sense of the world. We classify them. This one's wet, this one's dry, this one's hot, this one's cold. And he did kind of cut bits off in order to make them fit.
So we should file Culpeper firmly into the folk plant law section.
Yeah, kind of. It's a bit problematic because he studied medicine. He's more or less our patron saint, I think. Because he studied medicine and then he ran off, he eloped at the last minute and didn't qualify. And he made it his mission to translate the medical textbooks into English, which had not been done before. And of course, that immediately made enemies for him in the medical establishment because they liked a bit of mystique. And he also made a point of telling people when they came to see him in Whitehall, where he lived, Whitechapel, that the remedies they could find were very often growing in their own backyards. They didn't have to send for myrrh from far afield or exotic things and charge, that the pharmacists charge a lot of money for. They could pick them. They could go out into the fields and pick these things and find them. And the ones that you can find growing right next door are just as effective as the exotic ones. And the same is true today. People hear about wonderful cures that are growing in the remote Amazon or in the jungles of Borneo. And of course, it's the old mythology. Out there and over there and in the distance is more magical somehow than what's right here.
Yes, of course, yeah. So what you're saying then really is that Big Pharma has been around for hundreds of years and the same issues have been arising for hundreds of years.
Yeah, it kind of has.
If people want to explore this area more, either from the kind of plant law perspective, from the folklore side, or from the herbalism perspective in the way that you work with it, what are the key sources now for this sort of area?
You can do a sort of a short course in just learning how to use a few herbs very well. And in fact, when I wrote my first herb book, The Herbal Medicine Chest, they let me do what I wanted, which was to present around 40 herbs in some depth. because the principle was if you get to know just a few herbs really well, you can do a lot with those, as opposed to reading a book which has hundreds of them from A to Z. You read the book, or you pick dip into it, and you're no wiser when you finished it than when you started, because everything does everything as far as you can see.
Yeah.
You need to have a sense of how things do what and in combination with what. And that only comes from practice and, as I said, getting to know the character of a herb.
So you mentioned your non-fiction writing there. This is a beautiful segue into the next part of what we're going to talk about, and we'll make that jump in just a moment. But talk a little bit more about your non-fiction writing before we do.
Okay, the way I got into writing was through conversation with a therapist, Malcolm Stern, who wanted to write a book and didn't feel able to write it himself. And so I went to lots of groups with him, co-led them. I'd already been doing various therapeutic things for some years, and he would tell me what his ideas were, and I would go away and write. And so that became the first book, The Courage to Love, which was published by Piatkus and has both our names on the front. And then that was reissued as Falling in Love, Staying in Love, just his name on the front, because by that stage he was doing a television programme with a co-presenter and they felt it would be confusing to put my name there. But it was my writing. But that was my introduction into writing. And then fiction came later. That's another segue. Are we ready for that one yet?
Oh, I think we can make that segue. So your fiction writing definitely crosses over into the folklore side of what we're talking about, because your two novels are in front of me on the table. Sealskin, which looks at selkie lore, as you could probably guess from the title.
Yeah.
And The Fair Folk, and I think we can all guess what aspect of folklore that looks at. So let's start with neither of those. Let's start with a more general kind of point, which is, why did you decide to home in on these folklore-based themes for these novels?
It's a very good question. The reading, when I'm reading, the things that really excited me were to do with mythology. Sometimes fantasy, but not necessarily. Work that deals with the bigger issues, the truth beneath the truth. And I've always thought of it actually as, it's not escapism at all. It's a wish to see what lies below and beyond and behind. It's getting at the reality behind the surface world. And so the stories that stayed with me, and the selkie legend of the seals who come ashore and cast off their skins, and one of them gets captured and ends up having to marry a fisherman and bear him children. Stories like that, some of them stick in your mind because of the contradictions in them. And this was one of them. That particular story sort of teased at me, and I'd read Clarissa Pinkola Estes' analysis of that in Women Who Run with the Wolves. I'd read various sort of things on folklore, but that story has such a deep contradiction at its heart. It's always told as a sort of sweet, sad, romantic tale, and it's very dark.
Yes.
It's a story of rape and abduction.
Yes, often. This makes selkie folklore very tricky to deal with in some respects, because it has that angle, as you say, where people see it as a sweet, twee, romantic story, and sometimes it is.
Yes.
Sometimes that approach is taken, but that's not the common approach. The more difficult, problematic, troubling, abusive approach is the more common theme in selkie lore. It's a very difficult area to deal with in some respects. So what approach did you take with Sealskin?
Well, I thought about it for a long time, And eventually what I decided was I need to write this from the point of view of the man, the point of view of the fisherman, because I wanted to explore how this could have come about, how he could have done this terrible thing, and how he would live with himself afterwards. And the girl herself, I mean, people often write from that point of view because, you know, she's a poor helpless victim, and that's a place that it's easy to identify with. It's much harder to get under the skin of a boy, really, who would have done such a thing and then had to live with the consequences. And I also wanted to, I suppose in a way there was a kind of redemption story going on there, because I know, and you know, I have a son, I've always felt that alongside feminism, that there's a dark side which goes into shaming men, denying or wishing it wasn't so. The men's sexuality is very strong, especially when they're young, and it needs to be, you can't just not want it. You can't just not have that. It's something that needs to be addressed and worked with, and you know, most people end up being civilized human beings who don't do terrible things. But it is a theme. So I wrote it from the man's point of view, and I wanted to show how this could have come about, not altogether as a conscious decision. You know, he wasn't evil. It happened, in a way, it happened to him, as well as him doing this thing. And having happened, it made him ultimately into a much better person, because he had made a dreadful mistake and he learned from it.
And this of course draws on one of the key themes of folklore in a lot of folk tales is the redemption angle or the morality story, or
yes,
you know, and
exactly.
Folklore is used
teaches
so
you,
often for that. Yes, exactly. So I think this is a really unusual approach to take to selkie legends, but I think it's also a very brave approach to take as well, because you're putting yourself into the mind of the person who is traditionally seen as the evil character, the wrongdoer, you know, the bad person in this particular story. How did you go about putting yourself into that position and trying to reimagine from the male perspective, because you're a female author, on one case, putting yourself into the perspective of a particularly traditionally seen as evil character, again, the complete antithesis of the sort of person that you are. So how did you put yourself into that character to do that?
I think people are all more alike than they're different. I think that othering people doesn't get you very far. So again, it's going below and beneath the surface appearance. I think that people's desires and motivations are pretty similar when you get down to it. So I guess that's part of the answer. The other part is imagination. You know, you read lots and lots of books, you go into different worlds all the time. So that's one way of going into a place where you would think that perhaps it wasn't possible to go.
And we have to remember that's a really important part of writing as well, of course, because people are very quick to analyse everything. You know, your curtains are red. In the case of a novel, when you're describing red curtains, they must be red for a reason. You know, this is yes, a dangerous environment. You're trying to say something, you know, and at the end of the day, the author will turn around to 90% of people who ask these questions and go, no, they're red because I like the colour red and I decided they were going to be, you know, there's no inherent meaning behind these things.
No,
people are very quick to ascribe it.
In a novel there is, you know, as somebody pointed out, if there's a gun in chapter 1, then you jolly well know it's going to be fired at some point.
yes. There's very rarely anything that's just there for set dressing.
Exactly, because it's a novel, because it has to be concise.
Yes, exactly. So you've taken this approach. It's a very unusual approach, as I say. But how did that influence the way that you researched what you needed to research from selkie lore? I mean, it's something that you already knew stuff about, but how did you kind of take that aspect and go, okay, this is how I need to look into it?
I read as many selkie stories as I could find. I discovered that you don't just get them in Scotland and Ireland, they're all the way down the Nordic coast as well. And of course, animal transformation stories are all over the world. People everywhere have been fascinated by that idea. So I looked at the different variations, how do male selkies behave? How do female selkies behave? How have people sometimes tried to change the ending to make it happy, which never seemed very convincing to me. All sorts of different things. Plus the cultural milieu into which the story is set. So I decided that it had to be pre-industrial. It's not going to be a modern story. It's going to be a story of people living on the margins of subsistence living, farming and fishing, and they don't have much contact with the outside world. I think almost inevitably living in that situation brings magical things, magical events, magical beings much closer. They're always just over there, out of sight. So that gave me the setting, and the third thing, why it's set on the west coast of Scotland, is simply that I'm half Scottish, and it's that's in me. I didn't grow up in Scotland, but the rhythms of the language are very much in me from my mother and my grandmother, and it felt like a sort of redemption actually for my mother. I dedicated it to my mother, who never found her way home, because she didn't. She went down to live in England during the war, following her Canadian fiancé, who went off to the war, got taken prisoner, repatriated at the end of the war and met and married someone else. And there she was in the south of England. And she eventually married my father and had her children, and she never went back to live in Scotland. So there was always that kind of sadness, perhaps like somebody washed up on a foreign shore, out of place. Yeah. And I think that was also informing the way that I wrote this book.
How was it received? It is a different take on the selkie legend, as we've heard. How was it generally received?
Generally very well. I had an amazing publisher, Arenda Books, who publicised so brilliantly. I mean, it was, there was a blog tour which were much more prevalent at that time, got lots of reviews, most of them very favourable. Some people can't get past the rape.
Yes.
That's triggering, obviously.
Yeah.
And for some people, it's not a book they want to read any further. But most people have been really positive about it. And I feel very blessed to say that and some people have found it really moved them, really changed them, which is,
And it's been out for a little while now, but still easily available for people who want to pick up a copy.
Yes.
Yeah. So from there, we'll move on to your other novel, The Fair Folk, which obviously takes the Fae as its kind of root piece of folklore.
Yep.
This is out much more recently. Tell us a little bit about the plot for this one. Summarise, spoiler-free summary of this novel.
Okay, spoiler-free.
As far as you can.
As far as I can. There's a lot of me in this novel.
I suspected that might be the case, actually.
The protagonist at the start is a child, 8 or 9 years old, growing up on a farm, which I didn't, but I did grow up in the country, and I saw the signs all around me back in the 60s of small farms failing. I didn't understand what I was seeing then, that there was a whole post-war revolution that was going on that changed farming radically and moved it in a direction that we're now trying to row back from. But at that time, it was happening. I didn't know that I was seeing a lot of things for the last time, as it were. Small fields, small pieces of equipment towed by horses. I remember the working horses. All of that sort of thing was on its way out. And so there's that. There's the sadness of being an only child, having depressed parents who are always working too hard and not ever managing to pay their debts. And this child finds her solace in the woods and in books, and she is certain that there are fairies out there.
Well, we've certainly heard all of those things earlier on in this discussion.
And eventually, of course, they come to her. She doesn't know that they're observing her for a long time. They have their own agenda. And that's part of the point of this book, to write, as I did with Sealskin, as if these people, these fairies, were really out there. And one of the questions that intrigues me, if you start with that, that they're real, why are they so interested in people?
Yeah.
Ordinary, everyday peasants, people in the country, rural people, these are the stories they used to tell. And we're not talking about little fairies with wings. We're talking about medieval fairies, the older traditions. They were there in the country, everywhere, all over the British Isles and far beyond. People told these stories about encountering strange folk. And they appear in many guises. Sometimes they ask for favours. Sometimes they'll grant you favours, but there are always strings attached.
Yes.
Sometimes you just happen upon them, or do you? I mean, what is it that interests them about us? So if you start from that premise, it gets to be very interesting. How come they are there sort of dancing around the edges of us, unable to leave us alone when they've got all these magic powers, all this glamour? What is it about us that keeps drawing them back? And we know they sometimes need help. The famous story of the magic ointment is a case in point. They need help to help deliver a baby. Sometimes they need help to get a stuck axe out of a tree, that sort of thing. And yet they appear to have loads of powers that we can only dream of. So there's something odd going on there. And that their morality, the way they look at the world is very strange as well. And yet it's kind of familiar. And there I'm getting to spoiler territory, so I'm going to stop.
Yeah, we won't go much further than that. But we have to remember, of course, that Dr. Simon Young uses this term a lot when we look at fairies, of course. We're looking at the social supernatural.
Yes.
So before fairy referred to a diminutive sprite, fairy referred to purely the world of fairy, and it shines a light on our own world. It's a reflection, it's a mirror reflection of our world.
Exactly,
and those are the kind of areas that you're talking about there.
And we should say, probably some people wouldn't know perhaps that the fair folk is a euphemism that people used to talk about fairies. And fairies is a contraction of fair folk. Because if you called them the fair folk, rather like the Greeks calling the Furies the kindly ones, if you said nice things about them, it might make them nice.
You got on better that way, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you say there's a lot of you in this book, so the book moves from a young child in the woods to a university setting. I think it's fair to say that we can take that route without spoilering things that are happening, which also sounds very familiar from what you were saying
I wrote about what I knew at that point. Yeah.
But you also take it out of the rural setting and into a more urban environment then as well. So this whole kind of rurality of peasant belief and these interactions then also becomes subverted by taking it and putting it into a modern urban environment. And your protagonist goes to university and meets a very interesting lecturer. What can you say about that?
Well, again, I wish that there had been someone like Professor Edgerly around when I went to Cambridge, because at that time, folklore was thoroughly out of fashion. It was regarded as province, as Professor Edgerly says in the book, of country priests and eccentric spinsters. Anthropology looked at cultures that were far afield, or shading into sociology, it looked at urban culture. It was really downplayed, disregarded to look at the country traditions that we had come from, not that very long ago, of course. And even collecting fairy stories. When I first moved to Devon, I knew a friend in her 60s then who knew a couple who were very old but who had collected fairy stories, and they lived in Sticklepath on the moor. And that was the last, I think. Those were the last people who did that kind of thing. So it was all falling out of use. A bit like with herbal medicine. Nobody uses them for themselves anymore. They carried on the tradition of using herbs for animals because you have to pay for vet medicine. But the herbal traditions handed down for people had fallen by the wayside, and the fairy stories had gone too. Yes. So Cambridge at the time, it was very rich, yes, but in terms of local homegrown mythology, it wasn't as good as I hoped it would be.
So certainly, Professor Edgerly has been looking into fairy folklore for some time, so becomes something of a kind of useful character, not outside of the terms of the plot, perhaps, as providing that bridge between actual fairy folklore and the involvement of your characters in the story as well, which is a kind of interesting dynamic to use. Tell me a little bit about the research process that you use for this, because I think it's fair to say that fairy folklore is quite broad in terms of where you can go with it. So how did you narrow it down? I know you looked for specific things here and there because you asked me for a couple of pointers for one or two things.
Yes.
But there are many ways that you could have gone with it. How did you narrow it down, and what did your research process look like for that?
Okay, well, I wanted to tie it down to stories, traditional stories about fairies, and so all of what's said about fairies grows out of traditional stories. And I tried very hard to source them. I wanted to be able to say this one comes from that place in the British Isles and this one comes from that place. But they did prove, like the fairies, to be very elusive.
Yes.
I mean, the very first one I started with, simple story of the farmer who goes to market and gets distracted by the lights and the sound of a party in the woods on the way home. I couldn't find it anywhere. I thought it must be one of Lang's stories, and I went through all of the many-coloured fairy books. You can find them all in the Gutenberg Press now on Kindle, and I couldn't find it. I still haven't found it. And some of them I found very precise sources for, but I didn't manage to pin some of them down any further than just the British Isles.
Yeah, and this is the difficulty, isn't it, with these sorts of things? We have examples of the fairy fair from round here. Blackdown Hills has a prime example of a fairy fair, but that doesn't mean that it's the origin point of that. And that's the tricky thing to pin down. But isn't that folklore generally?
Of course.
Pinning down your origin is... Of
course, and a good tale will spread, and it will change in the spreading. Different people will add their own spin and so forth. So you can expect to find various versions of the same story. Yeah. But yes, that you can see that...
I can see that you've got Catherine Briggs on the table.
I have Catherine Briggs with many markers and also Magical Folk.
Yes, which I have to say is a good book because I've got a chapter in it.
Yes, indeed.
But it is a great collection because it does break all of the different themes down, obviously in the British Isles, at least by county. And there's some really interesting patterns that emerge there. So
yeah, and the same thing emerged from this too, my sense that people are not telling these stories now, not in the same way.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? If you look again at Simon Young's work with the Fairy Investigation Society and the Fairy Census, of which the latest version of the Fairy Census was published fairly recently, I mean, the stories are still reported, and there, there are other podcasts like Modern Fairy Sightings.
Of course,
that are
no,
talking
it's back
to
in
people about
fashion
these
now.
things. Yes, but there was this lull, wasn't there?
There was.
Where it really had. I hesitate to say it had fallen out of favour, because I don't think that these themes ever truly fall out of favour. It's the interaction with them, isn't it, that's different?
Yes, it is. That's right. And I think the rise of the internet has had something to do with things coming back into favour, because people who love this kind of thing can talk to each other.
Yeah, and this is something else we were talking about, actually, was it, before we started recording, so we should probably talk about it while we are recording as well, and it's this idea of the resurgence of interest in things. Give me your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's perhaps went underground a bit as we got more urbanised, as people turned away from things of the country. Only, 2% of people earn their living by agriculture nowadays. People don't gather around the fire after a hard day's work in the fields and tell tales to each other anymore. We have televisions, we have all sorts of other things to distract us. So there are all sorts of obvious reasons why this tradition of telling stories to each other, and we're talking about people who don't read in general, would have fallen by the wayside. But I think the hunger, actually, there is a hunger for these stories. And what I was saying earlier about the reality beneath the reality, I think that doesn't go away. And people do look for meaning beyond what they can see in the everyday world. And particularly when, like at the moment, things look pretty grim and scary, you look for other things to validate your sense this is not all there is,
And this happens in waves, doesn't it? If we think about, and I've spoken about this before, but I think it warrants talking about again in this forum, the resurgence of interest in folklore and folklore adjacent themes generally. I would argue that it's kind of generational. It's kind of like every 30 years or so, probably, we see a new kind of resurgence of interest. But it's definitely in response to very particular things culturally. So Victorian Edwardian period of interest, result of the Industrial Revolution. Post-war interest, sense of the need for nostalgia, the need for calm, for simpler times after the trauma of war.
Yes.
Resurgence of interest now, I would argue, it possibly goes along two lines. One is that same thing. The world is a scary place. It's the need for something simpler, the need for something more stable, more rooted, more natural. But also, I think that something that's driven the resurgence of interest now, to my mind, is what I've referred to in other places as the folklore aesthetic, which is the representation of themes of folklore artistically. So we had Boss Morris dancing on at the Brit Awards, or whichever awards it was, I don't remember.
Yes,
but that
music
sort of thing.
and art and dancing.
Yeah. We have things like Stone Club and Weird Walk that are very much the aesthetic, and then looking at some of the folklore behind it. But artistic representation is at the forefront of these things as well, and I think that's an interesting new resurgence as well.
Yes, and then plus people want to revive old customs like the wassail and so forth. That's gaining ground year on year.
Yeah, and that's nothing new, of course, because the revivalist folklore in the 60s and 70s was a very big thing,
along with
well.
real ale.
Yes, that's a very important part of the folk revival, I think, for many people. But folk song, those folk dance, folk traditions in that way. But also, custom. So we have a lot of seasonal events that don't have the longevity of having gone for hundreds of years like people think they have, but are revivals of seasonal events that went for hundreds of years up to the mid-1800s and then kind of got squashed. And then
it's sometimes put down as being pick and mix, but I mean, culture's always been pick and mix.
Yes, of course.
It can't possibly be any other way, actually. And, you know, the early Christians took a very pragmatic approach to that when they put their churches on the sacred sites. They understood very well that unless you work with it, it's just going to carry on working in the corners where you're not looking.
Yes. Yeah. You make use of what's already available to your own advantage. I guess that's probably one way of looking at it. Yeah. So you've approached selkies in your first novel. You've approached the fae in the fair folk. What are you approaching next?
I'm in the fairly early stages of writing a third novel, which is exploring the idea of a spirit of place. We all know places that have that feeling about them. You have a sense that there's something there. And in some cultures, it's actually expressed, like in Greek culture, they would have thought there was a god in that particular grove or near that spring or something who looked after it, and if you gave offerings you could ask questions and blessings and so forth. We have it in Celtic culture as well, and in various forms. Again, it's very widespread. So my idea is to look at a particular place, and I linked it to a little mystery. There was an archaeological dig some years back now. They discovered the skeleton of a medieval woman, and she was buried with a Neolithic hand axe. And obviously we have no idea why. But that started me thinking, what was going on there? What might that have been about? And putting that together with this idea of a sacred place and who these spirits might actually be. Again, turning the thing around, if there is something there, who is it and why? Why are they there performing this service for people?
So I'm sensing your archaeology and anthropology background is going to serve you well
It
with
might
this
do,
particular
yes.
project. How far into this? You say you're at the early stages of it. Are you past the research stage and into the writing stage?
I've done some planning, as you can see. I have quite a lot more research to do. There are different voices involved. Obviously, going back into the Neolithic time, it's such an interesting time because it was a time of transition. Obviously, we're talking of hundreds of years, but it wasn't an overnight transition. But when people started to settle down and grow crops and domesticate animals and make pottery and weave cloth, all of these amazing new ideas that had not been thought of before. It's very fertile, and also build enormous megalithic monuments. And the hand axes, there were hand axes for much longer than that, but they started to make beautiful axes that were clearly not for use.
Yes. Ceremonial, ritualistic.
Yes, again, we don't know really, we're guessing. So I have put one interpretation on that.
So you have a short piece that you have written that you're happy to share.
Yes.
Would you like to
this is
tell us a little bit about that?
From quite near to the beginning. One of the protagonists, who becomes a spirit of place, but at this point he's a young man and he's on a journey. The stone that he carries, the hand axe that he's made, is guiding him. He is, I guess we would say now, a kind of shaman. He is in touch with the spirit world. So he's going up a mountain, he's going to the other side with another young man who's been appointed to be his guide. Before noon we were on our way, our packs laden with extra furs and food enough for several days. Aaron went ahead, climbing the deer trails at such a pace that I soon had to ask him to slow down. A life spent on the plains had not prepared me for scrambling up a mountain, nor for the wide view, when after a few hours we found ourselves above the trees and stopped to take our bearings. "I didn't know the world was so big," I said, gazing out over lands that shimmered into the distance. "It gets bigger," he said, gesturing upward, "and then it gets very small." I followed his gaze to where the top of the mountain disappeared into cloud. "Do we have to go right up there?" I tried to keep the fear from my voice. In the stories my people told, the mountains were the abode of demons and gods, not a place where humans should go. He laughed. "Not today, there's a pass. We should reach it before dark as long as we move a little faster." Was he laughing at me? Young as I was, I read insult where none was intended. I got up at once and went to shoulder my pack. He lay back in the long grass, grinning. There was a gap between his front teeth, I remember, and when he smiled it was like the sun coming out. After a moment, uncertain, I smiled back. "Easy," he said, "we have time." High above us in the clear air, an eagle hovered, and against my heart the stone seemed to pulse, answering the eagle's cry. Endless plains, huge sky, the looming bulk of the mountain, and at my feet the fine wind-bent grass and the smiling boy. A web that held the whole world, with the stone at its centre, always moving, and myself with it. These moments of clear sight, as the old man of my tribe called them, were coming more often now, and sometimes half a day would pass in something like a waking dream, while others talked and laughed around me. Not on that mountain journey, though, where you had to watch your feet and keep your wits about you. This time it was only a brief pause. It was not long before the mist came down and the world shrank to a circle of wet black rocks and twisted bushes laden with spines. I was afraid then. Aaron was right in one way. To my eyes, at least, the world was very small, but my ears knew otherwise. Out there, beyond my sight, there were whisperings and stranger sounds, and all the time, step by step, my feet knew just how long the fall would be, if before us in the darkness lay not rock, but a sudden ravine or a tumble of boulders. All my senses cried out, "Danger!" and the voice of my little stone was lost in the clamour. Step by step, I followed Aaron as he made his way, reading signs that only he could see. And when we rounded a tall shoulder of rock and suddenly were almost swept from the path in a blast of icy air, I must have cried out or made some sound, because in a moment he was there at my side, shouting words I could barely hear. "This is the pass. We'll stop soon. Just a little further." He pointed ahead, but all I could do was nod and set myself to take a step and one more step, leaning on the wind as though it were a solid thing that we had to push through. Walking head down and with my eyes almost closed, I lost track of time and distance until I ran right into Aaron where he had stopped on the path. "Wait here," he said. He climbed onto the rocks to the left of the path and disappeared into the grey shroud of mist. And I stood there, feeling the wind stealing the warmth from my body, hearing the voices of demons flying by, until suddenly he was there again. Close to my ear he said, "Walk where I walk," and then was gone again. I scrambled to follow, clumsy and numb from the cold, scraping my hands on the harsh rocks, until there ahead was a dark, jagged hole, and we were walking right into the mountain itself. The sudden silence and stillness was like being wrapped in thick fur, though it was bitterly cold. "What is this place?" I could barely speak. He was busy unwrapping the firepot and making a pile of tinder and kindling near the entrance. "This is where we stay tonight. The mother will shelter us," and his grin flashed white in the flare of the firelight. "But we'll keep this smouldering just in case." He waited a moment, watching me, and then added, "There was a bear one time." I stared at him, determined to show no reaction. Although truly my face was so frozen, there wasn't much I could have done. "Then there should be some dry dung we can put on the fire," I said, and turned away. The cave was not deep, but I felt my way along the wall as I explored, in case there were holes or rocks to stumble over. There was plenty of dung, but it looked to be mostly goat or ibex, and I suspected Aaron's bear was a story made up for my benefit, and that he had gone ahead simply to scare away any creatures sheltering there. When I had filled my carry sack, I put a hand on the wall and made to rise. The firelight was stronger now. I glanced at the rock wall where my hand rested and stopped dead. A hand under my hand. I snatched my hand away, and it was still there, a shadow hand outlined on the stone. Smaller than mine, but every finger clear, as though someone was reaching out to touch me through the mountain itself. Slowly, I uncurled my fist and covered it, palm open, hand to hand. And then as I raised my eyes, I saw others, more and more of them rising into darkness like a flock of strange birds. The wonder of it held me fast. That's my little sister. Aaron had come to stand beside me. She went to the mother last winter. He squatted down. "Hey, Veri," he said, and put his own hand over the little outline. He was still for a moment. Then he got up, walked a few paces, and showed me another print higher up. "That's mine, from when I first came this way. My mother's brother helped me, and I tried to reach my hand as high as I could to be like the men. But it was hard to hold still for so long. See how the fingers are smudged here?" I saw too many to number. "Are these all from your clan?" "Whenever we come this way, we introduce the new ones to our elders. The old woman can name a lot of them." "So the mountain knows who you are." "The mountain's our mother. She protects us and gives us life. We don't all make the crossing, but those on the other side are our kin as well. My mother's brother lives there. You'll see." He was so sure of his place in the world. I can't say what my feelings were as I crouched there, surrounded by his family. Was I tempted, just a little, to let the stone fall among the rocks out there in the gathering dark, to turn for home before it was too late? But as the thought formed, I knew that it was already too late. It had been too late for a long time, since before I set out, even before I had brought the soul stone into being. This was my home, here and now. I brought out the stone and held it up. "Greetings, family of Aaron," I said aloud. "We are grateful for your guidance and your hospitality." He held out his hand, and I placed the stone into it. He looked at it, smelled it, ran his fingers across the surface. "I've seen rocks like this, green, with the lines like water in them. Not near here, though. It was further down, where the hills get lower, many days away." I nodded. "That's where I found it, or it found me." "Well," he turned away, "better tend to the fire." "Here, this'll keep it smouldering." I showed him the dung I'd collected. "Pity you scared away the goats that made it, or we could have had fresh meat tonight." "That would take too long, the killing and butchering and cooking. We need to be away at first light. There's plenty of dried meat for now." We rolled ourselves in our furs and chewed on the dried meat, listening to the voices of the wind outside. The old woman was right. A storm was rising, and we could not afford to linger in this high place. And so we built up the fire and slept and woke and slept again. And I dreamed of those who left their marks here, their hands clear and their faces in shadow, watching over us as we rested.
Thank you. So have we got a time scale, a publisher, a title for this work?
I think it's called The Soul Stone. And no, I'm not under contract or anything, so I don't have a time scale. I don't work fast, I have to say. So don't hold your breath. But yeah, maybe my present publisher, Europa Editions in America. We'll see.
We shall look forward to it whenever it is and whoever it is with. So finally, Sue, if people want to find out more about either your writing, your books, or your work as a herbalist, where would you like them to go? Online or anywhere else, in fact?
Well, I am on Facebook. I'm updating my writing website at the moment. I don't have a herb website anymore because I do believe that face-to-face recommendation, mouth referral is the best way to go. But you can find me and I have an email address which is openly available. I'm doing a tour in America soon in April and May, and I'm doing some book events in a few different places. So that's exciting. Going to New York and Houston and Boulder, Colorado. And I have a number of contacts in the Carter Horse Society, and I know you have some friends there too.
Yes, Brittany and Sarah I know very well. Yeah.
They've been wonderful. I mean, they are a real a tribe of folklore fanatics and fantasy lovers. Yes, there's a great groundswell of interest in America, certainly, and I'll know more when I return, I know.
Yes, I'm sure it will lead to all sorts of things. You could do far worse than doing stuff with the Carter Horse School for sure, and I'm sure you'll find the live events to be a really enjoyable experience, and
they usually are
great to see where those lead. Sue, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been an absolute pleasure to catch up and to be able to bring your work in all of its forms to more people, so thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark.
My pleasure. You'll find links on the episode page for this episode on the Folklore Podcast website to Sue's work. If it isn't there already, then there will soon be a review of the Fair Folk available in the book reviews section of my site too. As I mentioned at the top of the show, support for the Folklore Podcast most definitely equals content, and you'll find a donate button on the website, as well as a variety of subscription tiers at patreon.com/the Folklore Podcast, which will bring you member-only material and other rewards from just £1 a month. But don't forget, if that's not possible for you, then you can also join Patreon as a free member and still hear some other bonuses. Plus, sharing episodes and other content on Blue Sky and Facebook does so much to help to bring new people to the show as well. So please engage with me on there. It's fun too. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back with a new episode soon. Bye for now.